Today for ADG Pro, we're going back to an old tennis game which plays like a golf game, which I've barely touched in over a decade as it originally showed up in episode 8 of Ancient DOS games. That game being Serve and Volley. And our goal is a pretty simple one. Figure out whether the player stats are well balanced or not, and if not, what the optimal player stats will look like, and then compare that to the theoretical worst stats possible. So here's the thing. Serve and Volley actually tracks a whole bunch of stats transparently under the hood for determining how things are going to play out, updating them as each player competes in matches and tournaments. But when you originally create a player, you have 6 stats to adjust, which are presented as pairs of stats balanced with each other, whereby if you increase one stat, you decrease its opposing stat. Now, the 3 pairs we're dealing with here are speed versus endurance, forehand versus backhand, and power versus accuracy. And what we're going to do is find out if they really are balanced with each other or not. Though, there's a number of difficulties I ran into trying to figure this out. And the first, something I should point out about this game, which a casual player is never going to notice, there's actually quite a lot of bugs. For instance, when you do a computer versus computer match, if the player on the right side of the court wins, the trophy is still given to the player on the left side. This is only handled properly when at least one player is not computer controlled. Also, for some reason, I ended up with a glitched player here, where the percent of first serves was being reported as punctuation instead of as a number, and yet despite having perfectly even stats, they were consistently losing very badly from the left side of the court. Now, I ultimately just deleted the play.dat file, not to be confused with the player.dat file, as doing that reset the player roster to default. Another bug I noticed is that the guest players are never supposed to have any initial stats, but when you complete computer versus computer matches, if one of the opponents was player number 11, their stats will get updated, even though computer versus computer matches are never supposed to update the stats, and not for the guest players for sure. And lastly, whoever's on the right side of the court has an advantage over the left side, and I'm not entirely certain what's up with that. Just that my initial testing showed that players are more likely to win games from the right side than the left side. So for sake of all the testing I did, I made sure to run each setup twice, alternating which side of the field the test players were on each time. The one difficulty I ran into, which was not a bug, has to do with how you set player stats at all. These 3 bars are actually pixel accurate and range between 125 possible values, 62 on either side of the center value. Setting center stats or extreme stats all the way to the left or right is easy, but to see a range of possibilities, I needed a way to consistently get the stat markers onto exact spots. So say hello to Opti. Opti is a very basic piece of software I found online, which allows you to arbitrarily overlay images onto your desktop for whatever purpose you would need. Now in this case, what I used it for was I first took a capture of the stat bars, modified that capture to have set points I wanted to aim for, specifically 20, 40, and 62 points in either direction from the center, inverted the image, which left me with this curious looking thing. Then I overlaid this over top of my DOSBox emulation window at 50% opacity, thus causing it to create a perfect gray anywhere the colors matched, and other colors when they did not. Coupled with light taps of the arrow keys, this is what made it possible for me to hit the exact stats I wanted to test. Also, I hope you didn't get used to watching the gameplay at its normal pace, because for most of the rest of this video, you're going to be watching the gameplay like this. Yeah, we just went to ludicrous speed so that these tennis matches will be over in 3 minutes instead of 3 hours. As to get all the data I needed for my initial round of testing, I had to sit through 38 full tennis matches, and I wasn't about to do that at normal speed. Though the first test I had to do was to establish margin of error, as it's not possible for a tennis match to end in a draw, and there's absolutely some random factors going on here. Now, having a margin of error will give us a rough idea of how much variation will be normal and how much will indicate a definite imbalance. My initial tests gave me a margin of error of about 15%, which may seem like a lot, but it's ultimately not that bad for our purposes. So then it came time to test all of this. I did my tests as single matches on hard difficulty, best 3 out of 5 on a hard court. Supposedly the court surface makes a difference, and I did ultimately try testing that out, and yes, it technically does make a difference, but it's actually very subtle and thus wasn't likely to have much of an impact on the testing itself. But still, I kept it consistent to ensure that it wouldn't skew the results. Then, for each pairing of computer opponents, I would first set the first opponent in slot 11 to have the imbalanced stat that I wanted to test, indicating plus, double plus, or triple plus, along with a letter to indicate which stats were adjusted and to what degree, while setting the second opponent in slot 12 to be perfectly balanced. Then would do the match a second time, but instead opponent 11 would be the balanced player, and opponent 12 would be the one with the imbalanced stat that I was testing. Though there is the added complication of how I should make sense of the end results of all of this. For those not completely familiar with the scoring in tennis, let me condense it down as easily as I can. Every tennis match as a whole is split into sets, which are further split into games. The scoring starts at 0, often called love. Then for each ball won, the player's score goes up to 15, then 30, then 40, then they win the game. Then the server switches and a new game begins. If both players hit 40, a deuce is created where either player must win 2 balls in a row to win the game, going from 40 to advantage, then advantage to win. But if a player has the advantage in a deuce and the other player scores, the advantage is lost. Then it's 6 games to win a set, or 7 games if both players reach 5 games won for that set, and then I had it configured so that winning 3 sets would win the match as a whole. But then, what would be the most meaningful data to glean from that? Well, what I decided to do was run the 2 matches for each configuration of stats I wanted to test, then add up the total games won for each player and compare that to the total games played between both players to determine the percent chance of winning every step of the way for whichever player was not perfectly balanced. And so for instance, with the S triple plus test, the S triple plus player won a total of 18 games between both matches played, but the centered player won 37 games, so a total of 55 games were played, and thus the percent win rate for having maximum speed versus a perfectly balanced player was only 32.727%. Which means having max speed is actually a disadvantage, given that this reduces your endurance so much that the player's fatigue catches up to them too easily. Now, before I reveal how this all played out, let's address a couple other things. Firstly, I'm aware that because this is effectively a computer versus computer test, there's no human component involved at all. This is something I should have stressed more clearly when I covered the stat balancing in Star Control 2, is that it's very, very difficult to compensate for the human factor. So the best we can do as humans trying to find logic in balancing is to attempt to find a working average based on the average skill of people playing the game. And generally speaking, having the computer play against itself can do the job, provided the AI is done at least passably well. Heck, even here in Serve and Volley, there's no such thing as an impossible shot to return. So long as you're in the right position when the ball reaches your player, all that matters is that you hit that button when the bar coming down the left side of your info panel is inside the error range. And even if you have no margin of error at all, the 0 point always returns the shot successfully. Meaning if a particular person had this game dialed in exceptionally well, then they could play a character with reduced endurance or accuracy way better than the computer ever could, given that the computer attempts to mimic human error to some degree. In fact, that's something I should quickly point out about the difficulty setting too, is that all it affects is how fast the game plays and how much of an error margin the players get. The AI itself does not play better or worse on the different difficulty settings. I also want to quickly note the whole thing with the forehand and backhand. When selecting a shot type for your return to the opponent, you have 3 options: VS for volley or smash, L for lob, and FB for forehand or backhand. Now, with Volley Smash, the way it chooses which to perform is based on player and ball position. The closer you are to the net, the more likely you'll get a volley instead of a smash. As for forehand backhand, the choice is constantly being measured by the game which to perform based on positions. Thus, whether you get a forehand or backhand has nothing to do with the player's stats. Rather, instead, the player's stats determine which they can perform better or worse than the other, keeping in mind that whoever's on the left side of the court will be right-handed, and whoever's on the right side of the court will be left-handed. Yeah, it's kind of weird like that, but I think this was done so that the same sprites could be used on both sides of the court. Anyways, let's actually get to some results here, and I figure the best way to do this will be with a line graph. Now, there are 3 lines on this graph. The red line represents the balance between speed and endurance, green is forehand backhand, and blue is power accuracy. The far left side of the graph represents a player with maximum 62 points in speed, forehand, or power. The far right side represents a player with max endurance, backhand, or accuracy. And then the vertical position of each dot represents what percentage of games were won by that player against a perfectly balanced player. And these results are interesting. Let's look at forehand versus backhand first. This one's definitely the most revealing, as forehand shots actually fared better than backhand shots for whatever reason. Again, the handedness of the player changes depending on which side of the court they're on, so you'd think this shouldn't be a factor. Though it's definitely been made obvious that having too much forehand or backhand and not enough of the other is a bad idea. Next, let's look at speed versus endurance. What's interesting here is that having maximum speed is considerably worse than having maximum endurance, but having a little extra speed is actually better than being perfectly balanced. But then this got me wondering where the actual perfect balance was. So I investigated and found out that you actually want 22 speed, not 20 speed, to get the best combination of speed versus endurance. 24 speed is worse than 22 speed, 20 is worse than 22, and 18 is worse than 20. But then look at power versus accuracy. I think this one speaks for itself and shows that these two stats are absolutely not balanced appropriately at all. The more accuracy you have, the easier it is to win, plain and simple. Also, one last test I did was to pit maximum forehand up against maximum backhand, and yes, as these results suggested would happen, the max forehand player won handily, winning about 61% of the games from either side of the court, suggesting that having a lot of forehand skill, but not maximum forehand skill, would be appropriate. So let's put these results to the ultimate test, as I decided to play a couple sets against the computer myself. In this first test, I gave myself the optimized build of 22 speed, 40 forehand, and 62 accuracy, while giving the computer the worst combination possible: 62 speed, 62 backhand, and 62 power. To say this match was lopsided would be an understatement. The computer was playing so badly that it was frequently double faulting, and often didn't have any capacity to offer up anything less than a perfect serve. Suffice to say, this optimized build makes the game way easier. But then I decided to try it the other way around. I gave the computer the optimized build and took the bad build for myself. And yikes! You cannot play anything less than perfect with this build to win. But it did have one distinct advantage. Having the power stat so incredibly high means that if the ball gets up near one side of the court and you're able to return it to the opposite side, even a high-speed opponent may not have enough to reach it in time. So there is an advantage to having high power, but it's a lot harder to play the game this way. And this comes right back around to the human component. Functionally, power is clearly way worse than accuracy in this game, but it depends entirely on the skill of the actual player. The less accuracy you need as a person playing this game to hit your shots, the more you can dial back that accuracy stat towards power to give your opponents a harder time returning your shots. That doesn't mean the stat is balanced properly, rather instead it means that there's a distinct human factor related to it which the computer is unable to replicate. In any case, I think that's enough of this old tennis game for one outing. Though before I sign off, I do want to quickly address a question about it from one of my Patreon supporters, Simova, who simply asked, "Wonder if the first serve and second serve accuracies are different?" And they actually are, in more ways than one, both of which are pretty simple. If a player hits their first serve with zero error, then it's considered a perfect serve and the opponent will only be able to return it with a perfect zero error shot. Otherwise, they're guaranteed to miss. Now, if you fault your first serve, your second serve gets a fixed +2 margin of error no matter what, but even if you hit it perfect, it's no longer considered a perfect serve and can be returned by your opponent normally. So that'll be all for this ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on November 19th, will be the last ADG episode for the year, episode 306, where we're going to be looking back at the sequel to a game which I haven't actually covered yet. But I was sent a complete in-box copy of the sequel, and the original's stupidly hard to find, not to mention is one of the most heavily requested games for the show, so I guess this is just going to have to suffice for now. So be sure to stay tuned to see how the game plays and to see an amusing mistake in terms of the contents of the box. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.